afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. But if you would just make sure you please fill out the opening poll if you haven't already, and let us know in the chat who you are and who you're with. And then we're going to get started. So this is the monthly No Wrong Door open monthly workshop. And today we're going to talk about emergency planning and preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. So we'll go ahead and get us started, Angelina, if you can go to the next one. So first I want to do my shameless product plugs. So we have Good Life groups that Missouri Family to Family is doing every month, and you can see what the groups are here. We have a Blast Off with LifeCourse, a Launch into LifeCourse, a Planning Forward with LifeCourse, and a Sibling-Centered Good Life group, and you can see when those are. If you're interested in having, it's really for families, to be done by families, with families. So if you have any families that you would like to attend this, please just drop in the chat your information and we can send that out to you. And then I'll just kind of go through what each Good Life group is real quick, Angelina, if you can go to that next one. So the Blast Off is really for families by families, and it's really for people who have kids age 13 and under. Then go ahead to the next one. And that is, and then the Launch into Life course is for those kind of ages 14 to 26, maybe with transition and those kinds of things. That is the first Friday from 10 to 11. Go ahead, Angelina. And we have Planning Forward with Life course for people 27 and older and their supporters. And that's the first Monday at 10:30. And then I have one more for you. Very exciting. Then we have a Sibling-Centered Good Life group that's done by our own Becca Matthews, who has a sibling, a brother with intellectual developmental disabilities. And that is the third Tuesdays at 12. So please let your families know of those. And if you'd like to get on a mailing list or anything for those, please let us know. After now that I've done my shameless product promotion, we'll go to the next slide. And I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself because I feel like you all know me already, but I'm Julie Reynolds. I'm with the University of Missouri Institute on Human Development, and we're the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities for the state of Missouri. And I will let David introduce himself when his part starts. And then we have Angelina Alper, who is our executive producer, helping us out with all this here. So just to kind of remind us, we're here through the Missouri No Wrong Door Project, which, as we've talked about before, and I think you guys all know, but for all you new people, it really is, the No Wrong Door is really to transform the way people access services. It's to support people, their caregivers, to really figure out what they need to do, where they need to go, get accurate and complete information so they can really make decisions and have control of their life and the path they take in their life. Go ahead, Angelina. And this is just a little bit, what we're trying to do, as we've talked about, and really we're going on 2 years with this grant, is really help build that statewide network. So you guys are all part of that No Wrong Door network, whether you're with an area agency on aging, work in the developmental disabilities field, work for a Center for Independent Living, or an assistive technology. So these are kind of all the things that we want to do. And this is one of the innovative projects we're really trying to do, and just kind of have listed our partners there. Across the state, we have partnerships with state government entities, and then also the associations for different groups. So go ahead to the next one. I also wanted to make sure we talk a little bit about Medicare every time we do this, because I think sometimes if we're working with people, we think that's just for people over 65 years old, but really it's for people that provides health insurance for people over 65. And then also people with under 65 with specific disabilities. So, and I didn't know this till I looked at this. It is the largest health insurance program in the US and is growing by about 10,000 people a day. So just for some history, it was really originally signed into law by President Johnson in 1965. So I didn't know this either, but it was done in Independence, Missouri, our home state. So it was President Truman was the first person to sign up for Medicare. All things I didn't know, so I was very excited. And then if you go to the next slide, I want to just talk about the 3 parts of Medicaid that are the original Medicaid. So Medicaid, and this is all very confusing, and this is why we talk about it, and I will tell you next who's going to help you with this in Missouri. But Part A really pays for hospital stays, things like home health, hospice, some skilled nursing. And so this is what your FICA on your paychecks has been paying for, is some of that Part A information. And you can get all this on the Medicare website. Part B pays for people's medical care, things like doctor's visits, inpatient hospital services, medical equipment, which David could talk about at some point. And then part D, which is a fairly new part, well, not fairly new, but it's later than 1965, really pays for those drug coverages for people that qualify for Medicare. Okay, so go ahead to the next one. And all that is complicated, and I went through it very quickly, but Missouri Claim is really who is here to help you with Medicare. It's part of the state health insurance assistance program. And they're really there to advise people either who are on Medicare or who are wanting to get onto Medicare and really help them navigate this complex system. So if you've never tried to figure out Medicare, my mother is 90 years old, and I didn't realize in my state, I was in Indiana at the time, that there was such a place as a state health insurance and program that could have helped me with that. So now that I know, I can be more helpful to her. But there also can help if you're enrolling in Medicare, and really also resolving any kind of issues you have with it, talking to you about your prescription drug plan, and also what is an advantage plan and what does that mean for someone on Medicare. And then also if there's any grievances you have or any problems you have, they can help with that. So Missouri Claim is absolutely awesome. If you'll go to the next page, I'll show you how to get in touch with them. So basically their website is missouriclaim.org. There's a phone number, and they also have a Facebook page. So please, these slides and the recording will be out, but if you have any family members who need help with Medicare, or if you do and just have questions and want to educate yourself, Missouri Claim also does educational things and has multitudes of information. And we'll talk more about their training next time. And thank you, Angelina, for putting the number in there. So now we're going to kind of start on our LifeCourse framework a little bit and talk about how that fits in with this emergency preparedness. So we've talked about this. The Charting the LifeCourse really is here for individuals and families to explore all the possibilities in their life, to share information. The most important one I always say is set high expectations for what the system and other support services can do for people with disabilities and older people. So go ahead, Angelina. Today I'm going to talk about kind of a thing I know, I'm not sure if we talked about or not, but I want to really talk about the 3 buckets of support for the person and their family. So we're going to talk about buckets for a little bit. And part of the goal here is what David's going to talk to you about, is really helping to fill the buckets that I'm going to talk about. So go ahead, Angelina. So really we have what we call the 3 buckets, or just kind of 3 types of support. I'm going to go over each of them. So we have the blue bucket with discovery and navigation, where you can get information and training. We have the connecting and networking bucket, which is orange. And if I get the colors wrong, I don't see colors well. Kind of talking to someone who's been there. And then goods and services are the things that you can get from that. So I'm going to kind of go through each one of those so you have kind of a better understanding of what those buckets are and how we can fill them. So go ahead, Angelina. So really, let's talk a little bit. So discovery and navigation is really information, education, training on all the things that you might need with both within and outside formal service systems. So it's how do you figure out what is out there for you, and then what do you do to navigate it? So things like informational support, instructional skills, navigation, and advocacy. So what's important for people and families, and probably for all of us, because you all on this call are the front door of those supports, is once someone realizes that they may need some kind of support, kind of having to start out finding that, and which is a very difficult thing to do. But once they've kind of figured out, hey, there's such a thing as long-term services and supports, and there's Medicaid, and there's waivers, oh, there's Medicare, or there's, any number of things, or there's like park programs and recreation, oh, there's Missouri Assistive Technology, I might need some of that. Finding those things out and then figuring out how to get to them, how to kind of navigate those supports. So that's kind of that first bucket, and you want to fill that bucket with the information you gather, and also the information you gathered on navigating through that maze of systems. And then really there's connecting and networking. You found all this out. So how do you connect? How do you connect to the paid service system? How do you connect to families and other people who are getting those service systems, networking with them to find out, like, how did you do that? What did you do? It is a lot of getting support from those places, getting affirmational support, and then also building that social capital, building relationships, building social capital with people who have done this before and people who provide those things. So, you talk to someone like David or Scout, who might be able to talk to you about assistive technology, and not only pieces of equipment that are available, but also things like the services you can get through assistive technology and really making a plan for what you need. Then once you've kind of started filling up that connection and networking buckets, and your buckets might be filled up with different information, it's really what are the goods and services that you need, whether it's in the paid service system or non-paid service system, to get the daily supports you need. Can you fill up that bucket with some of the assistive technology David's going to talk about today? Do you fill up that bucket, with supports in your community? We talked about recreation a couple weeks ago. So how does that, or months ago, fit in? So go ahead, Angelina. And then I kind of just go into a little more detail here, information, educational, training, and best practices. But, what kind of information do I need in that discovery and navigation? I need to know about disability and aging best practices. What are their values? What do they think, and how would they support me? If I've got an older, if I'm going to use my mom for an example, how do I find information about how to support her as an aging adult with dementia? What do I do? And I'm telling you what, it was a struggle. I've been in this system for almost 40 years, really in the disability field, never in the aging field. So I had to learn all kinds of things and really have to discover and navigate, and then how do we really help people develop skills and then navigate? And there's really, it's not only like how do you navigate, but how do we help people build skills to advocacy so they can navigate those systems and advocate for those systems being better. So it's really filling up that bucket with all the things you need in a particular area. So go ahead, Angelina. And then again, the connections and partnerships. I talked about like the emotional support. So all of this, it is a struggle and stressful and somewhat of a trauma sometimes when you're going through a crisis or going through trying to navigate a system that you have no idea what's happening. So, how can we provide people, whether from a peer-to-peer basis or as the front door for people, with some emotional support, so they'll understand what they're discovering, how they can make those connections, and really kind of do some affirmational support of how can we affirm that what you're feeling is right. So I talked to someone who has a child that's 12 right now with a disability, and she told me when he was born in the hospital, they brought her this huge stack of papers and just left them with her. And she was so overwhelmed. She was, I just threw all the papers away because I didn't know what to do with them. So it's really supporting people so they can fill out that big room of papers, because you can't just bring them papers and say, fill these out. And then really building those relationships with them. And again, the social capital is so important, because those of us in the paid support system, we know we cannot be all things to all people. But what we can be is help people build that social capital and advocacy in those relationships so they can figure out all those things. And so they know that there are other people out there going through the same thing as they are. And just for you all that do the front door, you're going through a lot of things too, and you need some of these same things to fill your bucket. So connecting with other people that do what you do to really just talk about how did you solve this problem, or boy, this is tough on me. So that's kind of what that bucket for those connections and partnerships are for all of us. Okay, Angelina. And then last, as I talked about with the goods and services, how do you get, oh, look, I did my slide really badly there. So really, how do you maintain your physical health, financial health, material health, and how do you get things that you need to support you? Things like respite care, again, assistive technology, home modifications, how do you get physical and financial support? What's out there, so I make sure I have the resources I need to do all the things I've just discovered and navigated through and made connections on. So really those three buckets are things for anything that we're looking for out in the world. You want to fill up your buckets with all the things you need to navigate through the different systems and get the goods and services, whether they're paid or unpaid, that you need. So go ahead, Angelina. And then I already kind of went some questions you can ask. What information and skills do you need to accomplish your goals? Who can I talk to that might help me with that? And what are the goods and services? Oh, I know I'm being redundant, so we'll go on to the next one because I tend to be redundant. This is something for organizations, professionals to think about in discovery and navigation. Do you provide the information navigation skills as your primary role, or do you connect people to that support? So everybody out here does a little bit of both. And then how do we provide the peer supports, emotional supports? And if we don't, how do we connect people to that support? So I'm going to give a great example here. Some of that peer support and connecting and networking can be done through Missouri Family to Family, which is housed here at UMKC. We can help with that emotional support and that peer support that you guys may or may not have time or be able to do. And then, do you provide the goods and services, or are you just are you connecting people like MoAT to those goods and services? So kind of think about how you're doing that and what you're doing and who you can reach out to help in those areas. Okay, Angelina. And then sort of in touch points. So I'm kind of repeating myself again, but I think too, just thinking about social emotionally connecting with people. And then again, those day-to-day supports, and just remembering how we fill up those buckets. All righty. David's chomping at the bit. So just kind of wanted to show sort of how this all balances out. He's so excited about the emergency stuff. All these different, kind of human needs for the person, their family, and then really our system requirements. So we have that front door interaction, and that's what No Wrong Door is all about. How do you have that interaction with people when they first walk in that front door? If you're not the exact right door, how do we give like a warm handoff to another front door where the person doesn't know they're kind of going one place to another, but it's very seamless. And really all the things we do with them, in some of your fields, we may do some intake and assessment, or we may refer to other people. We always want to be doing person-centered thinking and person-centered processes, and then help people access support. Some of you out there do delivery of service, which is great. That's part of those buckets in that front door. And then really checking in and monitoring, what do we need to do? And all through every one of these processes, you may be putting different things in those buckets for people, but you always want to keep filling in with those 3 areas. So that just kind of gives you a systems overall with long-term social supports, what those buckets would look like. But it is that balance of what do people need and what do systems need, because we are all funded by systems. Go ahead, Angelina. And then I'm going to go into this next time, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview. So we're really going to talk about how you can use those buckets in those areas next time, through those different life stages, all the way from infancy to transitioning to adulthood and seniorhood. So I just wanted to give you a preview of next week. We'll do some next month, we'll do some tooling. All right. I think, if I remember correctly, it is now time for David to talk about what to consider during emergency situations. So David, it is all yours.
All right. Thank you much, Julie, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Baker, Director of Missouri Assistive Technology. And I know, I'm sure many of you I have crossed paths with, but for those who don't, Missouri Assistive Technology is the state's Assistive Technology Act program, and we help people understand and acquire and obtain assistive technology and related services. So what we want to talk about today is assistive technology in terms of emergency preparedness, or another way to say it is assistive technology considerations during emergency situations. And, today is a relatively nice day in some regards. I mean, we are having some rain here. I'm in the Kansas City area, but it's not threatening storms or anything of that nature. But there are those times that Mother Nature doesn't cooperate, or other events happen and they become emergency situations. And it's important that we have this concept of preparing for emergencies on our radar screen for everybody, for ourselves personally, for the people that are in our families, for the people that we serve. But there are some really unique issues when it comes to individuals with disabilities, and especially those individuals who are using assistive technology, that it seems to me we should probably spend a little bit more time paying attention to, drilling down on, understanding, and hopefully incorporating into the services that we provide and the relationships we have with the various people with disabilities that we know either personally or as family members. So the first 3, Angelina, if you want to turn to the next slide, I kind of want to start by setting the stage. And before we start kind of looking at some tips and tricks related to particular populations. So the first 3 slides are going to be getting informed, making a plan, and building a kit. Consider these to be the foundation of everything related to emergency preparedness for ourselves personally, and then also the individuals that we work with. So the first one here, getting informed. There's some basic things that we should always have in place, or things that we should be aware of whenever far in advance of needing to execute a plan related to an emergency situation. So, ask yourself some basic questions like, do you know what disasters are most likely in your area? Here in the Midwest, tornadoes, severe winter weather that might lead to electrical outages over a prolonged period of time, flooding. Those are very common scenarios in which we could have situations where people need to take shelter or other types of actions quickly. And so, which of those disasters that could strike any of us at any point in time would involve evacuating your residence or your place of work? Which ones would be most likely that you'd be sheltering in place? So, some basic things that maybe we should all spend some time kind of working through and understanding so that we have a framework in the event that some disaster comes along. Having some type of weather radio that's turned to a local emergency station and then monitoring the television and the radio are certainly good applications or good ways of staying in touch and being prepared, as well as maybe getting some of the accessing information through some of the apps like that, the one that's put out by FEMA, that's very useful in staying connected in terms of when things do happen and what kinds of actions you may need to take. So, and then, we often in the Midwest, it seems, kind of ignore some of these things, but there's a reason that alerts are issued and warnings are issued about severe weather. And it's important that we also practice what they suggest and be prepared in the event the weather comes up quickly or some other type of disaster. So the second sort of brick in the foundation is making a plan. So Angelina, if you want to move to the next slide. It's critically important. You can't make a plan when you're in the middle of responding to something. So all of us would be well served to create a plan in which we have a support network of people that can maybe assist us in the event of a disaster, and informing our support network where maybe we keep some emergency supplies or a bag maybe we've packed in advance if we need assistance in evacuating or going to a shelter or something of that nature. For people with disabilities, a lot of city and county emergency management agencies have some type of registration or I'm having a hard time, registry, that's the word I was looking for folks to self-identify so that they can receive targeted assistance, maybe become familiar with those in your community. Be prepared in terms of organizing and protecting some maybe extra medications or prescriptions or vitamins that you take so that if there's an emergency, you have a sufficient supply of those. There are some nice tools out there. There's one by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That's an online tool. In the event of a hospitalization or some other health-related issue, you may need to access your medical records. So, maybe have them with you or store them electronically somewhere where they can be accessed if somebody needs to get a hold of them. Maybe also share that information with somebody so you sort of have a backup if you're incapacitated. And then also become familiar with what the nearest medical facilities, local hospitals, and potential transportation sources might be in the event of an emergency. So these are some basic components of making a plan so that you're ready to spring into action in the event that you have to take cover or evacuate or take some other type of response to some type of emergency situation. And then the third, Angelina, next slide, is build a kit. It's pretty important, I think, that we all have some kit that we can grab quickly, that maybe we store in our vehicle or have in a closet right by the door. So if we have to leave very quickly, we can just grab it, and it has some basic things that are going to get us through a few days, a week, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of guidance out there on building kits, basically some basic survival supplies plus some items to meet an individual's needs. But when we're talking about building a kit for somebody with a disability, maybe a good kit also has some things that are unique to them. So for instance, I have two things highlighted here on the slide. The first one, maybe somebody wants to continue to feed themselves independently, or that's an issue that they think they want to be able to do, or that's going to be important in a situation. So maybe some adapted utensils might be something that they want to put in there, or these are some noise reduction headphones, which might be something that somebody identifies as being crucial because they believe that if they're in a shelter, they might be in a noisy location, and that might just add to the tension and the anxiety that the situation is causing. So a good kit would be some basic survival supplies that apply to pretty much all of us, plus some items that are unique to an individual that has a disability that can make the experience a little less traumatic, or a little easier for them to do as much independently and continue to do as much independently as possible. All right, Angelina, the next slide, please. So there are lots of ways that we could run this conversation, and there's considerable ways that we could drill down further, because every person is obviously unique and is going to have items or supplies or pieces of assistive technology that are going to be theirs and sort of individualized. But there's some broad brushstrokes related to preparing assistive devices in advance of an emergency situation. So it's always good to keep any electronic devices that somebody utilizes, maybe an augmentative communication device or some type of assistive listening device, or a electronic enlarger that has batteries in it. It's always good to keep things charged so that they have some juice in them if you have to grab them quickly, and then have extra chargers, extra batteries, and adapters with that device, because those are the types of things that might get lost or misplaced or something like that in a situation. Label all assistive devices and related components with the individual's name or some other type of contact person, so that if it gets misplaced or separated from the individual, somebody can hopefully follow up and get it back into their hands. Not all devices that people use are going to be explanatory or self-explanatory to individuals that might be interacting with them, like first responders or evacuation personnel. So it might be helpful to have some how-to instructions that somebody has with them, or could be posted or contained in a bag or something like that, along with the device. How do I disconnect a power wheelchair so that I can make it manual to move somebody onto a vehicle or something of that nature? How do I turn on this individual's assistive listening device? Or how do I work an augmentative communication device? Are just a couple of examples of where it'd be really useful for a first responder or an evacuation personnel to have some instructions to help them out so the whole thing runs smoother. If you're going to rely on somebody to help you in the evacuation process, take some time to review with them periodically, what are going to be your assistive technology needs during an emergency? What are some of the activities that they may want to pay attention to, or that they can assist you with? Kind of do a little bit of a dress rehearsal of, if this happens and I'm going to need this, and this is how it works. And if something goes wrong, these are steps A, B, and C that you might consider, so that we can continue to have that piece of assistive technology available. For those individuals who use communication devices, and I'm predominantly thinking of augmentative communication devices here. It's a good idea to have somewhere in those page sets or on that device some pre-programmed pages that have some information about the individual, some basic needs that they may want to communicate, and other things that are related to the idea of them evacuating or needing assistance, or some common needs and wants that may occur if they find themselves in a shelter or a hospital or something like that. Taking the time to pre-program those boards in advance could be incredibly useful for a lot of individuals who use augmentative communication. So, there's a saying out there: if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And these first three blocks are all about planning and thinking and being prepared. And from there, we can take a lot of other steps in the event of an emergency that are more effective and germane to kind of the situation that might be at hand. So now I want to kind of go down another level here and walk through just a few ideas for some particular types of disabilities or some particular situations that are common for a lot of folks with disabilities. So Angelina, if we move on to the next slide. Medications, a lot of individuals who we know and work with take medications, and those medications are going to continue to be important in whatever situation they may find themselves in. So one thing that shows up in some of the material that I read fairly often is that, create an emergency supply of medicines. And if you're not really sure how to do that or what the steps are related to being able to do that, that's a good subject to maybe bring up with the doctor or the pharmacist and see how you might set up an emergency supply so that you don't run out if there's a situation where you have to leave the home quickly and end up somewhere else. It's also a good idea to keep a list of all your medicines, including information about your diagnosis, the dosage, the frequency at which you take those medications, any allergies, any other related issues. Again, the idea being that if somebody has to provide you with assistance, this is a way for them to quickly get up to date on what's going on and how they can be of best assistance to you. So, one suggestion that you read out there is maybe this is something you just have on a piece of paper that's tucked in someplace safe in the bag that maybe you grab as you're going out the door. But there are also a number of apps out there that would enable you to keep this information so that it's available on a smart device, or maybe stored up in the cloud so that it can be brought down. And then it's really, one of the things I see quite a bit whenever I'm reading up on emergency preparedness is you can never have too many locations where you're keeping information. So maybe a piece of paper and an app and store it up in the cloud just to make sure you have all your bases and situations covered. Don't forget about extra non-prescription medications. Beyond what's prescribed, a lot of individuals are going to be using, taking aspirin and antihistamines and other types of non-prescription drugs that are very important on a day-to-day basis. So that, keep that in mind and always have a few of those on hand. And then there are a fair number of medications that individuals take that are reliant on being chilled or kept cool. And so having some cooler with some of the chemical ice packs handy that could be grabbed to put those in may be a very good idea, because there may be a situation where there's a power outage and there's no readily available place to keep those medications cool so they continue to be good medications and they don't spoil or anything of that nature. Moving on to the next slide, which are just a few tips for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. We already kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but a weather radio, and ideally one that has text display and a flashing alert. Just as sort of an FYI, there's a company here in the Kansas City area called Midland Radio, I believe. And I've just given them a little bit of a shout out because they make some of these devices. But one of the things that they have done over the years is actually come and consult a little bit here with Missouri Assistive Technology on some adaptations that can be incorporated into their weather radio that make it useful for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. So they have a bed shaker and a flashing alert that you can plug into their radio. So just a little FYI, if you're looking for a source of a weather radio that might be useful for somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing. Have extra hearing aid batteries. They will obviously wear out at some point in time, so having a few spares as part of your emergency kit is a good idea. And then pen and paper to communicate with someone who does not know sign language, if sign language is your predominant mode of communication. And down there in the bottom right-hand corner is a device that I call a boogie board. And it lots of ways boogie boards can be used in a lot of different situations, but it actually might make a nice pen and paper substitute. So you don't actually have to have pen and paper because they can get lost, they can get misplaced, it can get wet, something like that. A boogie board, you essentially just write on it and then push a button and it erases. So it's kind of like sort of high-tech carbon paper in a way. And that might be something that you could just throw in quickly that would enable you to be able to still communicate with somebody who does not know sign language. It might be a little bit more durable and easy to use. And then this is one that was news to me until recently when I was looking for some information on this particular topic. And that is a battery, batteries. It's a battery operated light source, meaning a flashlight. That was really just a lot of words for a flashlight. And this is something that should be basic in anybody's bag when you're preparing to a bag for a quick exit from a house or a facility or something like that. But one of the reasons that this was suggested for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing is that if they are somebody who uses sign language or they're a lip reader and the lights are out, or you're in a shelter and it's night or something like that, it provides a source to enable you to still be able to continue to communicate with them. This was sort of a duh moment for me when I read that, because I hadn't thought of it before, but it kind of made all the sense in the world. Can't really do effective sign language if it's dark. So next slide, we'll look at some tips for folks who are blind or have low vision. Some good ideas are to mark any emergency supplies with Braille labels or large print, depending on the individual's need. And over there on the right-hand side at the top, that's a Braille labeler made by a company called Logan Tech. That might be a quick, easy way of the inexpensive way of producing some Braille labels to put on various objects that individual would then be able to identify independently. And there are various types of lists you might want to keep on a portable flash drive or make an audio file so that the individual can consult it or retrieve it as needed and keep that information in a safe place. Maybe make a couple of copies and share it. They can share it with a couple of individuals so they have backup copies depending on how things might ultimately pan out for them. And then keep communication devices for that individual's particular needs and keep them as part of the emergency supply kit. So just a couple of examples here. Maybe somebody who's deafblind uses a deafblind communicator. So having the ability, ideally maybe having a spare or an older one that's part of the kit in case something happens to the one they're currently using. And then for somebody who maybe is low vision, this is a magnifier that actually is on a pendant, which I thought made a lot of sense in a situation like this, because if that's a significant enough amount of magnification for the individual, then by having it on this pendant that hangs down around their neck, it's easily accessible to them, and they're not going to have to worry about misplacing it or something like that as they go about their activities and various situations where they need to access print text and need it magnified. The next slide is a couple of tips for folks who have speech disabilities. And if it's somebody who uses an augmentative communication device, it's important to plan how they will evacuate with the device or how you will replace the device if it ends up lost or separated from the individual. And so, for instance, maybe somebody uses a standalone device, what we'd refer to as a dedicated device as their augmentative communication or their speech generating device. Is, for instance, the program that's used on that device, is that also available in an app form? And could they access it or have a backup copy of that program that could then be loaded on a tablet device or onto somebody's smartphone or something of that nature, is sort of a second version of that same communication tool, but using a different device as sort of the platform for it. Or there's an app out there called FlipWriter that might be a good suggestion to become familiar with and maybe have downloaded for if you're somebody with a speech disability. FlipWriter is what we would refer to as a text to text or text to speech, kind of depending on how you look at it, app. So what it would enable me to do is it enables me to be able to type in a message, and then there's a mirror screen that the individual who I'm communicating with would then be able to read. They type in a response and we can go back and forth in relatively real time and have a conversation. So that might be good for those situations where there might be some communication challenges in terms of between the speaker and the listener. Also really good because maybe an individual ends up in a location that is noisy, or they don't want somebody to overhear the conversation, so they could have a two-way conversation privately with another individual and just go back and forth, and there's no voice output, but it's a way of them to continue to be able to communicate. If you don't have any access to any device, it's a good idea to kind of maybe have some laminated cards with some common phrases or some picture boards or some really simple basic communication devices that are backup devices to any of the electronic types of devices that people frequently use. So a couple of examples here in the slide. That's a simple lanyard-based augmentative communication device made by it's a GoTalk. It's in the GoTalk family, and it's the Attainment Company is who makes that. And it's a digitized device, so I can program in, I believe, 4 different messages, but they might be basic needs and wants that would be useful in a situation. Identify myself, maybe give the name of my contact person, some information about, maybe some medications or some concerns I have. So just kind of tailored to a situation, but it's easy to record. Most people can do this independently or with a little bit of assistance. But if they are separated from their more traditional device that they use, this is a nice little backup. The wrist in the right-hand side there, it's a wrist-based device where it's just using pictures to substitute for, or as a way of helping somebody be able to communicate. And by being placed on the wrist, they could have it with them at all times and still have some tool by which they can communicate with other individuals. Next slide, please. And this, just a couple of ideas of things unique or some technology and some other accommodations for folks with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Maybe having an electronic device is very important. It's maybe a way of somebody self-regulating themselves or useful in terms of keeping their minds occupied in a stressful situation. So if you have handheld electronic devices that are going to be taken with you or can be taken with you, if there's even more so if the individual themselves has some electronic devices, then maybe it's a good idea to have some videos or some activities that are already preloaded into that device so that they can find a way of keeping themselves occupied under stressful conditions. And again, the idea of always having a spare charger available, because those are easy things to lose. This was, I thought, kind of an interesting idea for situations where somebody ends up in a shelter and the visual stimulation and the auditory stimulation in a shelter could be very overwhelming for a lot of individuals. And so maybe having a small pop-up tent or being able to make some kind of tent using some sheets and some twine is an idea to sort of decrease the overstimulation that they might be experiencing in such a situation. And it also is a pretty good idea for those situations where somebody needs privacy. You could take the same concept and apply it to an individual who maybe uses a wheelchair and needs some personal care assistance from time to time. The tent could function as a way for them to have some privacy as they're going about a private activity. And then noise canceling headphones are a good idea for some folks who have various types of disabilities, because they can be used to decrease the auditory stimulation that is going to be occurring both if they're in some kind of evacuation shelter, but also maybe that's just going on about them in the community, in the neighborhood, in a lot of different situations where there could be a lot of overstimulating auditory stimulation going on out there. And it's important for them to be able to decrease that in order to continue to maintain composure. Next slide is just a few tips for folks with mobility disabilities. So if you are a power wheelchair user, it might be a good idea to have a backup lightweight manual wheelchair. And so if for some reason you can't get in somewhere or transport somewhere with your power wheelchair, or it stops working, something of that nature, then having a manual wheelchair that's appropriate for you would be a good backup. And this is also a good time to remind folks that, Missouri Assistive Technology has the reuse centers around the state of Missouri, and those would be a good location to find a lightweight manual wheelchair that you might consider obtaining, so that there is a backup wheelchair that's available in case of an emergency. And then make sure that others are familiar with maybe how to assemble or disassemble and or operate your wheelchair. They can be a little bit intimidating for folks who are not familiar with them. So if you have a caregiver or a family member or a friend from the community who might be assisting you during an emergency, then making them familiar with how to do some of these basic operations would be useful. And there are other people that might come into your environment as well that would be good backup people who sharing this information with could be really, really useful in whatever situation you may find yourself in. And then if possible, an extra battery for a power wheelchair, and having one on hand and keeping it charged up would be a great way of preparing for an emergency situation, as well as having a patch kit or some kind of sealant that would be useful in the event that somebody unexpectedly had a flat tire in such a situation. And portable air pump would also be a good idea for wheelchair tires, and maybe an extra seat cushion to protect skin. And would be something to consider as well as part of somebody's evacuation plan or kit, depending on what the situation may be. The next slide is just some tips for individuals who have Alzheimer's and related dementia. It seems like it would go without saying, but since I read this in multiple sources, it must not go without saying. But in those situations, for somebody who has a cognitive related situation, it might be about, never leave that person alone, especially if it's in a congregate setting or it's a setting where they might wander away into an unfamiliar environment or situation. If evacuating, it's a good idea to maybe help manage the change in the environment that they would be encountering by bringing along a pillow or a blanket or some other comforting item that they could hold on to that just kind of reduces the stress that might be being created by the situation at hand. And then when at a shelter, it's advised to keep individuals that have these conditions away from exits and sort of choose, if possible, more quiet locations in the facility so that they don't wander away, or again, so that there's not excessive stimulation that's going to cause them to sort of begin to struggle a little bit as the situation goes on. And then lastly, just kind of a sort of a catch-all. Just a couple of other things that I just threw out there, extra eyeglasses, hearing aids, and batteries, if you have an extra pair of those, and I've already mentioned the batteries. A lot of individuals are relying on oxygen, and so having a backup supply of that, if that's at all possible, would be a good idea. And then, if you have a pet, it's support animal of some sort or another, or a seeing eye dog, then making sure that part of your planning includes, how am I going to, do I have some extra water? Do I have a collar with an ID tag on it for my animal? Do I have a sufficient amount of food? So that, because you have no idea really what's going to happen. So having these things lined up ahead of time would be a very good idea. And then there are a lot of low-tech devices. One of the things that I think would be useful, or is probably useful for individuals, is that you have as much as possible, you can maintain some type of normal routine during an emergency situation, even if you're in a shelter or you find yourself at a friend or a relative's house because of the situation. Some just basic low-tech devices related to adaptive utensils or dressing aids or magnifying glasses, just things that might come in handy that can kind of keep a sense of normalcy and continue to allow people to do things as independently as possible, would be something to consider as part of the planning in an emergency situation. And then lastly, up there at the top, I put calm which is obviously what you want to be in all situations, is to stay calm. However, there are some great meditation apps out there, Calm being one of them, that I know that if I was in an emergency situation, that I think I would probably be trying to find some opportunity to use one of those meditation apps to help center myself, a little more mindfulness, and to help me kind of work my way through the situation that is at hand. So kind of in total there, emergency preparedness is something that, to be quite honest, a lot of us don't do a really good job of, that we probably all know in the back of our minds we should do a better job of. And there's some basic stepping stones or building blocks around getting informed, making a plan, and building a kit. And these can apply to all of us and to all the folks that we work with and all the individuals we know who have disabilities. And then for those individuals with disabilities, depending on their needs or their particular condition, there are some good tips out there to consider, those items that may be necessary to them and help them through whatever situation may befall us, be it a flood, severe storms, tornadoes, any of the types of things that seem to be common in the Midwest, or some of the situations that other parts of the United States encounter for those folks who may not be joining us from Missouri. So at that, I will pause if there are any questions or comments or suggestions. One of the things I always say when I do these presentations is I know that there are great things going on out there. And if somebody has some information they've read or some ideas they'd like to share with the group, all the better. It makes us all smarter.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, chart, whatever. Or if you want to just, ask something. We're all friends here. We've been around each other for quite a while. Also, if you want to jump to that next slide, Angelina, you can, sorry, I thought that the next one. So anyway, while you're thinking, if you want to ask something, we do have our next technology workshop. It's June 22nd. It's going to be something around assistive technology for caregivers. So don't forget, that's going to be 12:30, and Angelina will be sending out lots of information on that. And I always want to note that in November and December, we are doing them on the third Thursdays due to the holidays. So please continue to join us, and then jump to the next one, please. And then you can always find things about the LifeCourse Nexus we talked about. And remember, all the things David talked about can easily fill all your buckets we talked about. And then last but not least, I think, there we go. If you think of questions, except this is for Scout. So Scout, you're going to get questions because I didn't put David's email in there. But David is just dbaker@moat.org. But if you think of questions later, or if you have any suggestions for future workshops you'd like to see or topics, please let us know. We're always glad to hear that information. We're always looking for ideas. You can tell we're trying to come up with our own because we start having kind of corny titles and stuff that amuse us. So if there's something that amuses you, you'd like us to talk about, that would be great. And then, don't ever forget with Missouri AT, David and Scout and their team is always available, to answer your questions or talk to you guys about assistive technology. And we're always available here at the China LifeCourse Nexus if you have questions or need more information about LifeCourse. I do not see questions, and we have 3 minutes left. So, I guess I'll give you 3 minutes of your day back. David, thank you so much. Angelina, thank you. And everybody, thank you so much for coming. Please do our closing poll as it pops up here. We always like to know how people feel, both at the beginning and the end of these. We do look at those poll results and keep track of them to try and improve, the work we're doing here. So we appreciate you guys doing that. We appreciate you coming, and we will definitely see you next month.